Okay, so this is my last video on this series that I've done on nihilism and how it's used in modern conversation. I was just so intrigued about how nihilism differs in how psychologists are using it and how philosophers are using it, how it's different than teens and how it's different than nihilism in adults, nihilism and autism, and just all the ways that this word is being thrown around in modern culture. And so for this last aspect I want to do, and then I'm going to move on to some other content, and I'm going to start doing interviews next month with a friend of mine, Bill Reel, who's going to start co-hosting with me. And we're going to start doing more interviews and conversations. So that's exciting. But for today, what I want to talk about is this new FBI qualification called nihilistic violent extremism, and how this nihilism word not only differs between psychology and philosophy, but now also politically. So let's dive in. So the working definition for nihilistic violence politically, and this is used in court filings and, Department of Justice press, is individuals who commit crimes to advance goals that derive primarily from a hatred of society at large and a desire to bring about its collapse by sowing chaos, destruction, and political instability. Now, to me, this is somewhat, I think, related to psychological nihilism, where you feel meaninglessness and hopelessness, and that can lead to violence. But it's really hard to connect that to philosophical nihilism, because in philosophical nihilism or moral nihilism, there's no up or down. There's no inherent reason to do anything because there's no access to objective truth or objective values or objective meaning. And so philosophical nihilism at its worst can be self-damaging in the sense that it can bring about depression or suicidality or numbing behaviors. But for someone to want to take out a building, there has to be a reason for that. And what reason could you have in philosophical nihilism? Because you don't have reasons for anything. And so for me, this political nihilism doesn't at all map onto what we understand nihilism to be philosophically. So how did this term come about? The FBI has been seeing more offenders with what they call mixed, unclear, or salad bar motives, right? It's not linked to a single ideology. It's more linked to notoriety or collapse or shock value, crimes like the Joker, where you just want to watch the world burn. And because it isn't like, oh, this is Islamic fundamentalism or this is white supremacy, reasons that they could understand, a goal that is understood. This new label is essentially this kind of shared bucket for cases where they're like, well, there's some shock value here. There's some desire for destruction and collapse. It doesn't really fit any of our other labels, so we're just going to call it nihilism. And so a person holding a philosophical view that life lacks inherent meaning is not what the FBI is labeling. So nihilistic violent extremism is about criminal violent behavior oriented towards chaos and collapse. And that can happen, on the political left or on the right, or it can be apolitical. And so now we have further problems for this word, because now anyone who just wants to create chaos for whatever reason, again, on the political right or the political left, now we're just calling it politically nihilism. And so this is unofficially coined the 764 network. And the FBI officials say they have hundreds of open investigations into this online nihilistic scene that pushes, self-harm and societal collapse. And it was flagged publicly after the Palm Springs fertility clinic bombing. And I did cover that when that happened, because that was a true case of Efilism, Efilism. It's actually life spelled backwards and then ism. And not philosophical nihilism, because that is philosophical Efilism. But, nobody knows the difference between those two things. So this was May 17th of this year in 2025, and a car bomb detonated outside a reproductive center in Palm Springs, California. And the bomber was this 25-year-old named Guy Bartkus, and he died at the scene. 4 to 5 others were injured, and he tried to live stream this attack. And now this was called a nihilistic violent extremist attack because it wasn't white supremacy. It wasn't a political attack. Like usually what happens at fertility clinics is more related to things like religious fundamentalism or politically related. And so it was something different. And so they called it nihilism. But philosophically, this would be an example of Efilism. Efilism is the belief that death is preferable to life, and the right thing to do is to prevent life from coming into the world. And in order to spread that message, he wanted to live stream bombing a fertility clinic, kind of showing himself that he is a hero by not letting those fertilized eggs come into the world like that. And that is pretty dark stuff. So the substantive content of the writings and online footprint points to antinatalist or pro-mortalist, Efilist motives, rather than the claim that nothing has meaning. Nothing has meaning is existential nihilism, and if nothing has meaning, then bombing a clinic, that requires a reason, right? And so that would not be, philosophical nihilism. It requires a morality that says non-being is moral and being itself is immoral. Again, that's not nihilism, because nihilism doesn't have inherent meaning or morality. So you can see how politically the term nihilism is really starting to get watered down. It's just used as a placeholder for chaos, for anything that doesn't fit some kind of clear ideological box. And so in that sense, nihilistic violent extremism is not a philosophical diagnosis. It's a bureaucratic one. It's a way for the FBI to label attacks that are unpredictable and born from despair rather than like a specific political plan. And so this new classification tells us something, though, about where society is. That when institutions start labeling violence as nihilistic, it signals that meaning itself has become unstable as a social glue. Traditional frameworks, religion, nation, political party, they aren't capturing everyone anymore. And so you have this generation of alienated young men who are not radicalized by ideology as much as they are depressed and just full of emptiness. And so they drift through these online spaces where irony and hopelessness and performative despair becomes their identity. And this is what's politically interesting here, because nihilism has always been treated as a threat to order, like from Dostoevsky's 19th century revolutionaries to today's digital world. And power structures, whether they be religious or governmental, depend on people believing in something. Like, that is what keeps society moving, that we believe in law and progress, even if it's the illusion of progress, and salvation and justice. And so when nihilism starts to erode that belief and meaning collapses, control collapses with it. So labeling violence as nihilistic becomes a way for the government to say, hey, this isn't terrorism with an end goal. This is the destruction of meaning. And, now we have a violent expression of that. And so it's important to remember, though, that philosophical nihilism, I really think, isn't inherently dangerous. Like Nietzsche, Camus, absurdists like Beckett, they were not advocating for destruction. They were just describing a human condition. Philosophical nihilism can just as easily lead to creativity and humor and empathy and play once you realize that, everyone is improvising meaning. And so the FBI is talking about behavioral nihilism, where there's no meaning and my life sucks and I'm mad at it and I'm sexually frustrated. And so this nihilism word just gives me an excuse to vent out my frustrations onto the universe. And so it's not a very deep existential reflection. I've read manifestos. I've read his and I've read others. I've read manifestos of school shooters and anyone who has, used the term nihilism in order to take violence out on the world. And this online nihilism subculture is much more of a vibe than a worldview. This is not good philosophy. And they claim to be rational, but at the root level, this is emotional. This is black pill memes and doom aesthetics and irony and nothing matters, so why try? And it becomes a way to feel rationally justified by quoting a few Nietzsche quotes out of context. And that rationally justifies your emotional experience that you are not enjoying life, that you as a young man feel rejected by women, you feel cut off from society, you feel cut off from yourself, from meaning and purpose, from a future. And so because you're not enjoying life, this is then just a rational justification for your emotions. I really think that's what's going on at root level. So this online subculture skews male, highly online, highly socially isolated. Their identity gets built around kind of this edginess and this superiority rather than true inquiry. And at best, they will borrow fragments, Nietzsche quotes absurdist lines as a shield for avoidance so that they don't have to engage with life. And they never actually try, like if they're quoting Camus, they never try to become the Sisyphus hero. Or if they quote Nietzsche, they never try to become the overman or, the Ubermensch who lives according to his own moral code. Or, they'll watch the existential elk theory, which I will be covering soon, and they never want to become the last savior, right? There are rational and even heroic responses that these philosophers came up with, but this online community doesn't engage with that at all. Nothing. Like they don't engage with that side of it. They only quote these philosophers when they're like explaining the problem, and then they just stay in the problem, right? They only quote the despair lines. And philosophy asks how you know and what follows and how to respond to our absurd situation. And this subculture just kind of asserts the meaninglessness, and then they stop there and they completely ignore the second act. So, Nietzsche's life affirmation, Camus' revolt, Sartre's like responsibility, Frankel's meaning making under constraint, which tells me that these isolated young men are really not interested in philosophy or nihilism as a concept. They just simply found a rational reason through a few memes to express their angst, and this is 100% emotional. And here's the tell. If nothing matters, why spend hours performing that online? Like why perform nothing matters as your identity all the time, right? Like the energy betrays the claim. And so what's actually happening here, I think, is pain management, like status through cynicism instead of trying for competence, and you're going to get belonging through shared contempt instead of connection. And so the truth is, I don't think that these young men that we're seeing who are described as nihilistically violent, I actually don't think they're true nihilists philosophically. This is the violence that we're seeing because they are hurt and disconnected men, and we had no other category to call them. And so this rage and taking out a fertility clinic to save the fertilized eggs from the curse of life is an expression of their emotion about life. They're lonely, directionless. They've mistaken cynicism for wisdom. They don't go on to like how all the philosophers respond to nihilism. They just use it as an excuse to not engage with life. And so the cure isn't more ideology, because what they're doing is not philosophy. The cure is re-engagement with life. There's not a single nihilistic violent extremist who, when you look at their life, you say, wow, they had great relationships and hobbies and good friends and meaningful work, and they're well connected and they have service projects. Like not a single one. And so these young men don't need to be told to believe in life. They have to actually taste life again. They need mentors and rites of passage and male friendships where vulnerability isn't mocked, and they have to be invited out of this abstraction and back into embodiment. So what I'm seeing is that online nihilism gives you this illusion of control, that you're sitting above it all and you're judging the world, and you never have to risk failing at life, because nihilism in this weird way becomes your comfort blanket of saying like, hey, you don't have to try. They're all sheep scurrying around for meaning, but not you. You're the wisest of them all. The real work is actually stepping back into the world that you've been scorning and doing something about it. Even the nihilism subreddit on Reddit eventually shut down, not because of violent extremism, but because of like internet bureaucracy. It closed during the API protests in 2023, and the mods never fully reopened it. And there's something like so poetic about that for me, that a subreddit dedicated to meaninglessness went offline because they were protesting corporate policy. And so it just shows me that I think most people drawn to nihilism online really aren't plotting violence. They're just disillusioned, ironic, trying to find connection in digital despair. And for anyone wondering, like the API is just like how apps talk to each other. Reddit started charging for that in 2023. Many of the communities protested. And so even the subreddit shut down over it, which is kind of perfect, right? Like the people who say that nothing matters cared enough to protest corporate greed. And so it shows me that most online nihilists like really just aren't plotting chaos. They're just exhausted and they're cynical and they're craving fairness and connection in a world where they are disconnected and they feel like the world is unfair. And so when we truly look at philosophical nihilism at its darkest, I don't think we see bombing fertility clinics. We see people like Philip Mainländer. He was a German philosopher and poet who lived during the same intellectual era as Schopenhauer and Nietzsche. And Mainländer believed that the universe itself is fundamentally suicidal. And in his magnum opus, The Philosophy of Redemption, he wrote that in 1876, he argued that God once existed as a unified being, but then committed suicide by creating the universe. That was his theory. And that matter and energy and all of existence is like the fragments of God's corpse, like reality itself in divine decay. And so from that point on, all of existence is just a slow return process, like returning to nothingness and entropy and death and dissolution as the ultimate destiny and true redemption of being. And so for Mainländer, the highest moral act is to align yourself with this cosmic drive towards non-being. And he did carry that out, right? So he produced his book and then he hung himself the day that it was published. And so I definitely disagree with his philosophy and I disagree with his understanding of the universe, but it was at least a philosophy. Like he thought it through and he lived it out. Like I can at least give him that. And so while Nietzsche called for the creation of new values after the death of God, Mainländer celebrated death itself as salvation. And so Nietzsche said, could become who you are. And Mainländer said, let's cease to be. And so he was 34 when he hung himself. And it, again, it was like the morning his book was published. And he saw suicide as completing the logic of his worldview. And so to me, I think that's why he represents the darkest possible endpoint of philosophical nihilism, where intellect and despair kind of collapse into one. It's not rage like the violent nihilism that we see in like school shooters today. It's like surrender, like I surrender to non-being. And the self kind of aligns with this cosmic will to die or this cosmic trend towards entropy. And that is what I think is the darkest edge to philosophical nihilism. And I'll talk about that in the coming weeks because I'm going to talk about the existential elk theory, not written by Mainländer, but kind of a similar vibe with a little bit happier of an ending. But what this means is that philosophical nihilism at its worst is self-ending, and it's not fundamentally destructive to others, because you have to have a reason for wanting to be destructive to others, like towards some end goal. And that's really hard to explain if you're truly philosophically nihilist, right? What this really is destruction to others because I'm hurting and some dark corner of the web told me to take that hurt out into others. And there were some cheap quotes from some philosophers here and there. And I'm going to take out my hurt that I don't feel like my life is worth living. So I'm going to, take this rational justification to take my pain out on everybody else so that everybody sees how much pain I'm in, right? I really think that's what we're looking at. So this isn't a crisis of philosophy, I really don't think. These are young men who were never taught how to find meaning in uncertainty, how to suffer, how to lose, how to build character, how to engage with life. And in that vacuum, irony and despair and algorithms filled that void. And the FBI didn't know what to do with these violent outpourings that you get from time to time. And again, like this is still anything termed nihilistic violent extremism is still a much smaller percentage of violence than, for example, Islamic fundamentalism, white supremacy violence, and also the violence of the political right still trumps the violence of the political left. So this is a very small, but once in a while you do have this violent outpouring that we have this new category for, nihilistic violence. But philosophical nihilism was never meant to end in apathy or violence or even depression. It was meant to strip away the illusions so that what's left, experience itself, which is the only thing that we know for sure, And compassion and art and laughter and touch and beauty could really mean something because it's so fleeting and because it's so precious. And so to me, the void isn't the end. It's certainly not a justification for violence. It's where philosophy actually truly begins.